Okay, World History Chapter 6, Civilizations of the Americas. The focus question is, what circumstances helped the civilizations and diverse cultures of the Americas to develop in ways that are both common and unique? So one of the things that you can do to kind of help you with your essay writing is to use the clues and the suggestions, and you're going to find that in each section of the assessment section at the end, and then also throughout the chapter. So kind of be paying attention to that. So we're looking at these Mesoamerican civilizations. So this is Middle America. So it'd be, for example, Mexico is primarily where we're going to find these at. And so there's lots of different things that are going to be popping up in these Mesoamerican places. So what factors encourage the rise of these powerful civilizations in Meso, meaning Middle America? By the end of this chapter and section, you should be able to describe when and where people first settled in the Americas. And it's important to note that the most recent model is different from what the book has. Analyze the main characteristics of the Olmec and the Mayan civilizations. Outline how the Aztec Empire and society took shape. So those are the things that we're going to be looking at. So for a long time, what people believed is that the earliest Americans got here 10, 12,000 years ago following herds, and that there was this brief period of time where the ice sheets had an indoor corridor and that they could follow that and get to the Americas. Now, the book has this old model, but this isn't how we understand that to happen today. And the reason being is there's more archaeological evidence, and with DNA testing, what they have found is there were multiple waves, more than likely 3 to 4, possibly 5 different waves. Earliest wave was maybe 50,000 years ago. And not only did they probably walk across this ice-free corridor, but more than likely they used boats to sail along the coastline of the Americas, which explains how they were able to get to the southern tip of South America far earlier than we had ever previously thought. So be aware that on the test, it's probably not going to be this land bridge theory, that there's these multiple waves, that they probably took the land bridge plus a water route, and this occurred much earlier than we previously believed. The Americas are a lot like Africa in that it is a north-south continent, and so you're going to see a wide variety of different environments. And why this is important is because there's a whole host of different environments. People are going to adapt to those environments and create a culture that's unique to their own specific environment. And so that's why when we talk about the Americas, it's far different than a lot of these other places that we talked about where they had more things in common and there were more similarities in them. So when we look at these very first people, just like other places that we talked about, they begin to farm and build villages. What's a little bit different is what it is that they are farming. So one of the things that they are going to be planting is potatoes. If you ever get the chance to go to Seed Savers, they have a whole host of potatoes that you typically don't see. And so this graphic on the right shows all the different types of potatoes. Now, the other thing that we see kind of happening throughout the Americas is wherever it started, this is going to kind of spread throughout, but what the Native Americans referred to as the Three Sisters, planting corn, squash, and beans together. And what you get with that is for the corn, the squash is going to kind of help keep critters away from the corn, but it's also going to kind of help support the stalks as well as the beans. But the beans are also going to put nitrogen back into the soil, which the corn uses up. And so these three things were grown together because they really work well together. Now, one of the keys to the Americas is that there are few domesticated animals. There are, like, for example, llamas in South America, but what ends up happening is because of the Native Americans getting here, most of the big land animals are going to be hunted to extinction. So unlike other places that had cattle and hogs and those types of things, Native Americans aren't going to have that. Now that's going to become significant for a couple of different reasons. One is they don't have these beasts of burden that can do all of this really hard work for them. The other thing is they're not going to be exposed to diseases that Europeans are going to be exposed to, so they have no immunity to it. So when the Europeans come here in smallpox and chickenpox and cowpox, when those things go back and forth to humans, Europeans built up an immunity to it that Native Americans won't. Dogs are domesticated, but that's really about it. When you look at the Olmecs, what is significant about the Olmecs is that they're going to be the mother culture of Mesoamerica. Basically, the art, the writing, the calendars, some of the trade practices that they have, those ideas are going to spread throughout Mesoamerica, and other places are going to adopt what the Olmec did. So it's kind of like the beginning of the Mayan and the Aztec, and they're just going to build upon what the Olmec had already done. When we look at the Mayans and their specific agricultural practices, they practice what's called slash and burn. What they do is they start to look at the fact that maybe their farm fields are starting to become a little bit infertile after 5 or 8 years or so. So what they start to do then is they'll go into the rainforest, they will slash some of the trees, cut away the bark, and allow those trees to die. They'll cut those trees down, they will burn that up, till that into the soil, and then they will move their fields to that location. And then what will happen is they'll let the old fields grow back up into rainforest, and they'll keep rotating their fields that way. The other thing that they do to kind of deal with flooding is they build raised fields so that the floodwaters would stay away from them. When we look at the Mayans, they're most similar, I think, to Greece. They build these like city-states throughout at different points in time. Each of these different city-states is going to kind of become the one dominant city-state. They have these rivalries that take place between them, just like the ancient Greeks. And the other thing is they're interconnected through trade, which is also a lot like the ancient Greek civilization. When we look at their structuring of society, it's just like these other places that we talked about in terms of social pyramids. This structure isn't that much different than most of the other places that we talked about. And so these people are going to kind of, again, all throughout the world, create a very similar social pattern that takes place. What we know about the Mayans is from these temples and these palaces. And what the Mayans are going to do is they're going to have these sculptures on their buildings that are going to have all kinds of different writings. And so that's really how we're going to learn an awful lot about these Mayans. They have scribes that are going to use a hieroglyphic style of writing, and you can see that here. They have these stone stelas all throughout the empire that are telling the stories, recording history, recording events. They also had these bark paper books. Unfortunately, when the Spanish and the French arrive, a lot of them are destroyed. So there's very few that exist in modern day. When we look at the cultural life and some of the things that the Mayans accomplished, their astronomy and mathematics is pretty high tech. They have 2 different really time calendars. You have the 365-day solar calendar that kind of keeps track of when to plant, when to harvest. They have another calendar that's going to be used for rituals. And then they also have a numbering system that has the concept of 0. And again, what that does is that allows them to do some pretty advanced computations that you don't have without that number 0. When we look at Mesoamerica and some of the things that they're going to have in common, so we're going to point out differences, but some of the things that they're going to have in common is their architecture. They're going to have these pyramids that are very similar to each other. They look similar across the different ones. You're going to see that their form of writing that they're going to adopt from the Olmec are very similar to each other, and so they have this common form of writing. And then they all seem to have this game that is played all throughout Mesoamerica that seems to have some kind of a sport and ritual component to it. And so you see these ball fields that are built all throughout Mesoamerica. You even see them in smaller scale in the southwestern part of the United States. So you see that this Mesoamerican culture is going to impact what's going to become like present day Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. There's going to be this common cultural connection between those places. Aztec, when you look at them, they are a group of separate tribes that all speak the same language. And they're going to eventually settle in what's today Mexico City. Tenochtitlan is Mexico City. Within that, they have Lake Texaco. And there's two major islands in Lake Texaco. And what the Aztecs do is they create their capital on those two islands. And they have these roadways that connect it to the mainland. And because they are in the middle of the lake, they build these floating farm fields called chinampas. And this is where they do all their agriculture. And what they're going to do is these two islands are going to kind of grow as they add population and as they add more farm fields. And that's eventually going to grow into Mexico City. When we look at the Aztecs, they're probably most similar to the Roman Empire, because what's going to happen is through conquests and alliances, they're going to build a pretty large empire that's going to take over most of Mesoamerica. At the height of this, there's going to be 5 to 6 million people living under the control of the Aztec Empire. When we look at its society, war is kind of at the key of all of this, just like the Roman Empire. War is what's going to bring in wealth. It's going to bring in agricultural goods. It's going to bring in trade goods. When we look at the structuring of the government and society, you have one single ruler over all this empire, and that ruler appears to be elected by a group of council members. And then just like the other places that we talked about, you have nobles and priests that are pretty high up in the social hierarchy. You've got middle-class merchants, but the vast majority of people that are living in this Aztec, just like a lot of the other places that we talk about, are commoners, slaves, and serfs. And so this is going to be, again, a very similar social structure that we've seen to other places. When we look at kind of Aztec religion, they believe that the gods had created the world over many times. So they have this secular view of history. So it's a little bit like the Chinese and their dynastic cycle, that what's going to happen is the gods are going to come in, they're going to build up this society and eventually destroy it, and then it's going to come back again. And they also believe that God sacrificed themselves for the good of the people, and that's why the Aztecs are going to sacrifice people to honor the sacrifice that the gods made. When we look at the Aztecs, they're going to kind of expand on what the Mayans have already done. It's the priests that are really kind of keeping track of everything. They're the ones who are writing down laws. They're the ones who are writing down historical events. And they're going to form a calendar that's very similar to the Mayans. You're going to have the solar calendar, and then you're also going to have the ritualistic calendar. And that, again, dates back to what the Olmecs did, which is adopted by the Mayans, which the Mayans then are going to eventually get it taken over by the Aztecs. And the Aztecs are going to kind of keep that tradition alive.